My name is Lauren Whitfield. I was 29 years old when my family stopped pretending that love was unconditional. For 8 months, my boyfriend David and I had lived our lives in 2-week increments. Blood tests, temperature charts, whispered conversations in the dark that always ended the same way, with me staring at the ceiling, wondering if my body was quietly failing at the one thing it was supposedly built to do. So when the second pink line appeared, I didn't scream. I sat on the bathroom floor with my back against the tub and cried so hard my chest hurt. David found me there, still holding the test like it might vanish if I let go. He knelt in front of me, hands shaking, and kept saying my name like it was a prayer. We didn't tell anyone for 3 weeks. We let the secret live just between us, fragile and perfect. The night we finally announced it was supposed to be safe. A Sunday family dinner, neutral ground. My mom's house. 25 people crowded around the long granite island, plates clinking, wine being poured, conversation overlapping. I waited until dessert, until everyone was relaxed and full, before I stood up with my hand resting lightly on my stomach. I have something to share, I said. David smiled at me, already tearing up. I'm pregnant. For exactly 3 seconds, the room exploded with sound. Cheers, gasps. My mom dropped her fork. My aunt clapped her hands together like she'd been waiting for this moment her whole life. My younger sister's chair scraped violently against the floor as she stood. Her wine glass shattered against the countertop, red liquid splashing like a wound across the granite. "How dare you?" she screamed. The room went silent. I remember thinking she must be joking, some kind of dramatic overreaction that would turn into laughter in a moment. Bethany had always been intense, emotional. But this? "You knew," she said, pointing at me, her whole body shaking. "You knew how long I've been trying. You knew this was my turn." Mom rushed toward her. "Bethany, you're only 20. You're not ready for—" "Shut up!" Bethany shrieked. "I deserve this first. You don't get to steal it from me." David stepped forward. "No one is stealing anything. This isn't a competition." Bethany laughed, a sharp, broken sound. "It is now." She grabbed her designer purse and stormed toward the door, turning back only once. "You have 1 week, she said, voice trembling with fury. 1 week to fix this, or I'm calling the police." The door slammed behind her. No one spoke for a full 30 seconds. The next morning, Bethany showed up at our apartment. David opened the door in his pajamas, still half asleep. She shoved a stack of printed papers into his chest. Clinic information, highlighted phone numbers, handwritten notes in the margins. "I made appointments," she announced loudly. 3 places. She just needs to pick one. I stood frozen behind him. When David tore the papers in half, Bethany screamed so loud our neighbor's dog started barking. Within hours, she'd called the entire family, demanding an emergency intervention. That Sunday, 25 relatives packed into my mother's living room. Bethany stood by the fireplace like she was giving a TED Talk. She had a PowerPoint, slide after slide, explaining how my pregnancy had ruined her life. Charts, timelines, a slide titled, "Why Lauren Should Do the Right Thing." When Uncle Robert, our lawyer uncle, finally interrupted and said, "There is absolutely no legal precedent for forcing someone to terminate a pregnancy because you want to be pregnant first," Bethany collapsed into tears. "If she doesn't do it by Monday," she sobbed, pointing at me, "I will never speak to any of you again." We called her bluff. All 25 of us. Bethany left that night screaming and sobbing, slamming doors, swearing we'd regret betraying her. And then she disappeared. For months, there was silence. Until 7 months into my pregnancy, at my baby shower, when the door flew open. Bethany walked in, one hand on an enormous belly, wearing a shirt that read, "First grandchild loading." "Surprise," she said sweetly. "I'm almost due." The room went silent. When I mentioned my due date, 7 weeks before hers, her face darkened. She grabbed my arm and whispered, "Dates don't matter. I'll make sure mine comes first." And for the first time since this began, fear settled deep in my chest. The moment Bethany whispered that to me, "I'll make sure mine comes first," Something inside my excitement fractured. I tried to shake it off. I told myself pregnancy hormones were amplifying everything, that she was just being dramatic again. Bethany had always lived loudly, emotionally, recklessly. This was just another performance. But the unease didn't leave. At my baby shower, Bethany stayed barely 20 minutes, long enough to parade her stomach, accept forced congratulations, and ensure everyone saw the smug curve of her smile before she swept back out the door. No gifts, no hugs, just that sentence echoing in my head. Dates don't matter. That night, I lay awake beside David, listening to him breathe, staring at the dark ceiling. "She doesn't make sense," I whispered. "Her timeline doesn't work." David rolled toward me. "You're overthinking. She's lying to herself, not to us." I wanted to believe him. 2 weeks later, my mom called me sobbing. "She's in the ICU," she said. "Bethany." The words didn't register at first. ICU belonged to strokes, car accidents, heart attacks. Not my sister, who'd been smugly spinning around a baby shower weeks earlier. Mom kept talking, breathless and hysterical. "Her roommate called me. She collapsed. They rushed her in." "What happened to the baby?" I asked. Silence. "I don't know," Mom whispered. By that evening, the truth began to unravel, piece by horrifying piece. Bethany hadn't just been lying about being almost due. She'd been panicking, desperate, terrified that my baby would arrive first and expose her timeline as impossible. She'd been ordering black market labor induction drugs from some sketchy website, taking them without medical supervision, trying to force contractions weeks too early. But that wasn't why she ended up in the ICU. What finally broke her body and nearly killed her child was something far worse. Bethany had found a woman online. Craigslist. The woman claimed her mother used to be a midwife in Mexico. Bethany paid her in cash to perform a C-section in her apartment, in her living room, at 32 weeks. The woman tried to refuse, kept saying the baby wasn't ready, that this was dangerous, that she didn't know what she was doing. Bethany threatened her. She told her she'd do it herself with kitchen knives if the woman didn't help. They used box cutters, sterilized with rubbing alcohol. Bethany lost so much blood that it seeped under her apartment door. Her neighbor saw it and called 911. The baby survived the extraction, but barely. He was blue when they pulled him out, not breathing on his own. Rushed straight to the NICU on a ventilator. Bethany needed an emergency hysterectomy. She would never carry another child. When she woke up, weak and pale and tethered to machines, the first thing she did was call me. "You did this," she gasped through the oxygen mask. "My baby is dying because you couldn't wait your turn." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at the phone until David gently took it from my hand and ended the call. What I didn't expect, what none of us expected, was how quickly the family split. Half of them said what Bethany did was insane, unforgivable, dangerous. The other half hesitated. One aunt said maybe I shouldn't have announced my pregnancy so soon. Another whispered that Bethany had always been sensitive. One even said, out loud, that maybe I should have terminated early to spare her feelings. David shut that down immediately. But the damage was done. Suddenly, everything revolved around Bethany's baby. My pregnancy faded into the background. Doctor appointments became afterthoughts. Any update I shared was quickly redirected back to the NICU. I didn't fight it. I didn't want to. My baby was mine and David's, not a family spectacle. 3 days before my due date, I was admitted for monitoring. Bethany's baby was still critical. The doctor told my mom the next 48 hours would determine whether he survived and whether there would be lasting brain damage from oxygen loss. That night, I saw Bethany for the first time since the baby shower. She stood in the hallway between the NICU and maternity ward. She wasn't looking at the rooms. She wasn't watching the nurses. She was staring at my stomach, not with anger, with something colder, something calculating. My induction was scheduled for the next morning. Bethany knew the exact time. She'd been asking the nurses questions about delivery room locations, about whether babies were ever left unattended, about where newborns were taken after birth. The NICU was 1 floor below maternity. If her baby didn't survive the night, I didn't want to finish the thought. At 3 a.m., I woke up to David pacing by the window, whispering urgently into his phone. "She's watching the hallways," he said. "She's timing the nurses." I sat up, heart pounding. Within an hour, the charge nurse added a special security code to my chart. At 4:30 a.m., a man knocked on our door. "Detective Frank Morrison," he said, holding up a badge. "Hospital security supervisor." He walked us through every safety protocol: electronic badges, infant security tags, automatic lockdowns. At 5 a.m., a social worker named Sarah Collins arrived with a clipboard, documenting every threat Bethany had ever made. My phone buzzed nonstop as the family group chat exploded. Half of them accused me of overreacting. The other half shared stories about Bethany I'd never heard. Times she'd scared them when she didn't get her way. Uncle Robert texted privately, offering to fast-track a police report. David replied, "Yes, please," in all caps. By the time the sun rose, fear had replaced exhaustion, and I realized something chilling. Bethany wasn't just unwell, she was watching, waiting. At 7:23 a.m., my daughter entered the world screaming. For a moment, just a fragile, suspended moment, nothing else existed. They placed her on my chest, warm and slippery and impossibly small, her tiny fists curled tight like she was holding onto something she'd almost lost. David broke down completely. He sobbed into my shoulder, whispering her name over and over like it was anchoring him to reality. The nurse snapped the security bands onto her ankle and my wrist so fast it felt rehearsed. I didn't mind. I wanted every alarm, every safeguard, every locked door they could give us. Within the hour, they moved us. Not to the nearest recovery room, not to the standard maternity wing. They wheeled my bed all the way down the hallway, past rooms with nameplates and balloons taped to doors, past elevators, past nurses' stations, until we reached a room at the very end of the corridor. No name on the door, no whiteboard. Detective Morrison walked beside us the entire way. "This room doesn't exist on public directories," he said calmly. "You're listed as private patients with restricted access. No one gets information without the security code." David asked what would happen if Bethany tried anyway. Morrison didn't hesitate. "She'd be detained." David nodded, jaw tight. Inside the room, the lights were dim. The walls felt too quiet, too contained. David pulled the nurse aside immediately. They set up a code word system. "If we say pineapple," he said, "you take the baby to the locked nursery immediately. No questions." The head nurse wrote pineapple in red marker on the shift report and personally showed it to every nurse coming on duty. My phone buzzed nonstop. Family, friends, demands for photos, questions about why we hadn't announced anything yet. David typed one message to the group chat. "We're taking private time to bond. Please respect that." The replies came instantly. Selfish, dramatic, overreacting. I stopped reading. Detective Torres, Robert's contact, arrived mid-morning. He sat across from my bed with a notebook, asking me to recount every threat Bethany had made since the dinner. When he mentioned the woman who'd performed the surgery was being questioned and would likely face charges for practicing medicine without a license and child endangerment, I felt something twist in my chest. I didn't feel relief. I felt numb. Dr. Williams came in shortly after with an update on Bethany's baby. "He's stable on the ventilator," she said gently. "Still critical. The next 24 hours will be important. There's concern about oxygen deprivation." She hesitated before continuing. "Bethany keeps asking about you," she added. "Psychiatry is concerned about her fixation, but she's too weak to leave her bed. Safe for now." That phrase echoed in my head long after she left. David's mom texted us a single sentence. "Check Facebook," Bethany had posted from her hospital bed. Photos of her pale face, tubes taped to her arms, captions about how I'd stolen her future, how I'd forced her into desperation, how her baby might die because I refused to wait my turn. She tagged everyone. Every aunt, every cousin, every family friend. Detective Morrison returned minutes later. "Someone's been calling the nurses' station," he said, "pretending to be different relatives, trying to get your room number. No one has the security code, so nothing's been given out." 20 minutes later, a woman in a suit knocked. Hospital PR. She held printouts of Bethany's posts and screenshots from local news sites that had already picked up the story. "Please don't post anything," she said, "and don't speak to reporters if they reach out." An hour after that, Sarah returned. No clipboard this time, just a thick folder. "CPS has to open an investigation," she said quietly. "Because of how the baby was delivered. We'll need statements from everyone involved." 3 days later, we were cleared for discharge. David spotted his cousin Nathan sitting in a car in the visitor parking lot, camera in hand, waiting. Detective Morrison confirmed he'd been there for over 2 hours. We didn't leave through the front. They packed our belongings into bags and brought a cart through service hallways I didn't even know existed. My daughter stayed wrapped against my chest under my jacket as we followed Morrison through empty corridors, past the hospital kitchen, out through a loading dock that smelled like diesel and old garbage. At home, everything looked the same, but nothing felt safe. I jumped every time the doorbell rang, checked the locks constantly, slept in 30-minute increments. On our third day home, Detective Torres arrived with a security camera system, paid for by a victim fund. He installed it himself, walking us through how to check the feed from our phones. The next morning, a cardboard box sat on our porch. The camera showed my mom had dropped it off at 5 a.m. Inside were baby clothes from when Bethany and I were little. Washed, folded, a note saying she loved us, but needed time to process everything. That afternoon, Dr. Williams called. Bethany's baby had started breathing on his own, for 15 minutes at a time. Brain scans looked better than expected. Critical had shifted to serious but stable. At 2 a.m., 4 days later, David's phone rang. Unknown number. The voicemail was Bethany. Shaky. Furious. "You destroyed my life," she said. "You stole my baby's future." David reported it immediately. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for Friday. The judge extended it to a full year, with criminal penalties for violation. Bethany was transferred to a long-term psychiatric facility, 3 hours away, for at least 6 months. When the house finally went quiet again, I held my daughter close and listened to her breathe. For the first time since that family dinner, I felt something close to peace. But I knew the story wasn't over yet. 2 weeks after the restraining order was finalized, Sarah Collins called with news that made my hands shake. Not from fear this time, but from relief. They had found placement for Bethany's baby. His father's parents, Colorado, stable, married for 30 years, financially secure, no criminal history, no history of enabling Bethany's behavior. "We've officially removed you from consideration as caregivers," Sarah said gently. I sat down on the edge of the couch, my daughter sleeping against my chest, and exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding since the ICU. I felt terrible for feeling relieved, but I was. Because loving an innocent child should never require putting your own baby in danger. A few days later, the psychiatric facility called David directly. They explained Bethany had been transferred to a specialized long-term treatment center that focused on postpartum psychosis and trauma-related disorders. The intake coordinator spoke calmly, professionally, like she'd had this conversation hundreds of times before. "At minimum, she'll be with us 6 months," she said, "possibly longer. There's no discharge date until the treatment team agrees she's stable enough for outpatient care. No visitors without approval. No contact with me." That night, David scheduled a video call with the extended family. 25 squares appeared on the screen, some faces familiar, some dark, cameras turned off. David did most of the talking. He explained that we would send one monthly update email, no individual texts, no surprise visits, no relaying messages from Bethany. Boundaries weren't punishments, they were protections. Most of the family agreed. Aunt Claire didn't. "She's sick," she said, shaking her head. "This feels harsh." David looked straight into the camera. "What's harsh," he said evenly, "is expecting my newborn daughter to absorb the fallout of someone else's untreated illness." No one argued after that. 3 days later, my mom called. She told me she'd signed up for therapy at the community mental health center, joined a support group for families of people with severe mental illness, started journaling. I wrote down everything, she said quietly. Every time I made excuses for her. Pages and pages. Her voice broke. I don't know how I missed it. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to explain. Detective Torres called that Friday. The woman who'd performed the surgery had taken a plea deal. 5 years in state prison. Possibility of parole in 3. Charges included practicing medicine without a license and child endangerment. I felt no satisfaction, only a dull sense of inevitability. Life slowly narrowed back to manageable things. Feedings, diaper changes, learning how to use the breast pump without crying in frustration. Wednesday mornings at the library with 8 other new moms sitting on yoga mats, talking about diaper rash and sleep schedules. No one there knew about restraining orders or security codes or hospital lockdowns. They just saw me as another tired woman learning how to keep a tiny human alive. David set up a family communication system, 1 weekly email with basic updates. No photos unless we felt comfortable. No replies. Cold. Necessary. Every morning I pumped extra milk. David drove it to the hospital in a cooler labeled for the NICU donation program, along with preemie clothes we bought just in case our daughter arrived early. We never visited Bethany's baby, but this felt like the right distance, helping without reopening the door. At 2 a.m., during one of those quiet feedings where the house feels suspended outside of time, I held my daughter against my chest and listened to her breathe. No buzzing phone. No guilt-laced messages, just soft darkness and the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. The family wasn't fixed. It probably never would be, but we had built walls around our little family that felt strong enough to hold. Sometimes the most entitled thing someone can demand isn't just your choices, it's your future. And protecting what matters most doesn't always look loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looks like silence, boundaries, and the courage to let other people's storms rage without you standing in the rain.